Okay, we are live.
All right. Welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a guest talk series every 2 weeks, focused on protocols and protocol research. Today, we have a special guest talk with Summer of Protocols program lead Venkatesh Rao, in which he will synthesize the research from the summer. Our next town hall will be a researcher salon with Chanel Hart on her research project, Addressable Space. You can find the program calendar along with more information about the protocol kit and Summer of Protocols at summerofprotocols.com. And yeah, so now I will hand it off to Venkat to get this party started.
Let me share my slides here. Can you guys see my screen? All right. Yeah, funny we're calling this guest jobs. I think we should call them town halls, and then guests are guests. I think I'm like more of a host here. Let's
I
see.
think we put town hall in the title on YouTube.
Yeah, good. So this is partly a talk, but before I get into the talk part of it, I did want to click over to the Summer Protocols forum. Can you all see this? Yeah. So there is a thread here for this talk. The slides are linked there so if you want to look at them. And looks like Jenna has already posted the live stream video. But yeah, please, if you have longer comments, please post them there. And if there's like very quick remarks you want me to look at during the Q&A part, post them in the Zoom chat itself. But also, while I'm talking about the forum, so far in the program, we've pretty much been internally focused, and most of our conversations have been inside our Discord or Telegram, and we're slowly trying to shift the center of gravity, especially of the more substantive conversations outside the walls, so to speak, so more people can participate. Random drive-by people with interesting insights can share them and so forth. So we're doing a couple of things. One is, of course, every time we do one of these town halls, we start a thread on the forum for those who want to discuss it. And also, as we continue to publish the research, we start a thread on each each of the published research items. So you can see in the research, there's already like threads for some of them. There's some active discussion on David's standards make the world essay. And we're going to continue to do this and sort of like figure out how to make these conversations work. So there's this research category. We just started this protocol talk category, which kind of we're trying to replicate our more sort of informal shit posting category that we had on Discord. So any random musings and thoughts you have on protocols, post them here. John Grant, who's been one of our more active community participants, has posted a couple of really interesting links or sort of mini essays here, I would say. And also, this is the place if you find like interesting news about protocols or something, post them here. I wish there was a way to like pin all categories, but yeah, we just started a third category yesterday, which is town hall, and this is the first thread there, since this is a talk that's not related to a particular essay. So yeah, explore this, and also if you look at, let's see, if you go to your profile pic and go to your profile thing, there's a preferences thing, and I haven't yet figured out quite how to make it work. But there's a notifications and a tracking. Oh yeah, this tracking tab allows you to like fine tune what you're watching and how. So I do recommend, especially in these early days as we're trying to bootstrap this forum, that you kind of like set your pattern of alerts so you get to hear of like new topics, new threads, especially in the categories you're interested in, right? Uh, so that's all I wanted to say about the forum. Let's see. Okay, let's start here. Let's see. How do I keep forgetting how to like present us?
You click the slideshow button there.
Okay, there we go. Okay, That should make it easier. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of thinking in the last 3 months or so on the future of this program. So yes, quick note, yes, we will be running a Summer of Protocols 2024. More details TBD. We're not going to be actually talking about the specific operational sort of like details of that or doing Q&A about that. We'll do that stuff later. This is kind of more of the philosophical reflection on what happened last year, where we are, and what's kind of the interesting directions we can take it. So we've been having these conversations in multiple places. So at DevConnect in Istanbul, we convened a brainstorm which had like some of the staff people plus internal EF advisors, plus a few participants from beyond, like people who might potentially work with us next year. So it was a very interesting brainstorm, including several of the researchers were there providing their feedback. So it was, that's one source of inputs. The second source of inputs is we've been having like backroom conversations with people who might be involved next year. And the third is, of course, internal conversations between Tim, Josh, myself, and a few other people from EF, like Josh Stark, Danny Ryan, and Trent. Many of whom you've seen kind of around the program. So this is kind of my attempt to like distill those conversations into like the high level takeaways. So let's get going. So the sort of overall theme I came up with is the challenge for us now is to take what we have and formulate a protocol, build out of it. All right. So I like to start whenever I'm involved in like projects like this with what I think of as the effectuation question. There's I think a book about it and a website called effectuation.org, but it's a very interesting mindset that apparently is associated with successful entrepreneurs and others who have like big impacts, that they tend not to be goal oriented, as in they don't start with this is a problem in the world that I want to solve, or this is a end state vision of the world that I want to achieve, and how do I get there? They tend to start with where they are. They look around and say, all right, what do I have? What can I do? What are the interesting bits and pieces in my environment? What's some surprising new tool or technique or technology that we can use to do something? So you start with what you have and then work forwards from there, rather than starting with where you want to end up and working backwards from that. So my natural orientation is very effectuation oriented, but I didn't have a word for it until I like saw that material. But yeah, this describes how I think, and I think this also describes how sort of like uncertain, complex entrepreneurial type things go. And even though this is a research type program rather than entrepreneurship, I think many of the same principles apply. So whole talk is going to be effectuation oriented. All right, so quick outline of what I want to cover. What do we have from 2023? That's kind of the effectuation starting point. So what are we starting with? What do we have? This might seem like the exact backwards way of like addressing the questions. Like if you're starting with the end in mind, goals, typically you start with like meaning and purpose and why are we doing this at all? Then you kind of like try to formulate goals and say, what do we do? And then you finally get to how, right? So you go from why to what to how. Effectuation mindsets kind of like challenge that intuition and go with, all right, we have some things like, you have a hammer in your hand and everything looks like a nail. That's kind of the mindset. So it's like, all right, how do we do what we want to do? So start with the how. Then it's like, all right, we kind of have a sense of our agency here. What do we do with that agency? Then finally you get to, all right, once we are screwing around and if you'll excuse my French, doing the whole fuck around and find out approach to doing stuff. Only when you have like a stream of activity going do you ask, why are we doing this? And then like, try to like step back, ask the philosophical motivational questions and so forth. So that's kind of the approach I want to take. So I want to start with how, then what, and then get to why. All right. And then we'll do a brief preview of 2024, not getting into too much of details. All right. So where are we starting from? Honestly, when I put this slide together, it felt really impressive. Like a year ago, Tim and Josh, if you remember, we kind of had nothing. We were like talking and it felt like we were bullshitting. We didn't know what the fuck we were doing. But now it's like we have so much. Of course, the most important ingredient is the people's. That's the picture we took at the end of our retreat in summer 2023. So that's all of us. I think that's all 30 of the 34 researchers were present. A few couldn't make it, I think, 30, 31. And then there's the staff plus a couple of like guests. So we have an interesting group of people. We have a set of ideas. So if you look at summerprotocols.com and click on the research tab, you'll see the stuff that's already published, and then you scroll down and there's like a ton. And this time last year, we had nothing except like, some conversation notes from those of us who were in the discussion back then. So Tim and I and the others, we had some conversation notes, and we were just starting to draft what became the pilot study. So all we had was like nebulous ideas. Now we have a binder that's probably going to be too small. We have like 500 plus pages of content, and we think it'll barely squeeze into this binder we've ordered. So they're going to start shipping soon, by the way. We have, I think, an interesting container. Like when we started, we had a hacked together like Notion site with just random like pages put together anyhow. Now, thanks to Josh and Jenna, we have this really awesome polished website showcasing all the research. By the way, Josh and Jenna started putting together PDF was already there, but we now have EPUB and HTML versions starting to get out. So many of the pieces already have EPUB and HTML pieces. So really, we are putting this in a proper container. We have the beginnings of a nascent community. So even though it's like not yet spun up as a flywheel, there's a sort of like community out there beyond just the researchers who are interested in watching the program. And we've just put this infrastructure in place, the forum, to try and like, I don't know, coalesce that in a better way. We have memory archives. So I've started thinking of this not as like, content repositories or whatever, but thanks to Kia's influence on all of us with her research on memory protocols, I keep thinking in terms of like memory. Institutional memory is kind of almost a definition of memory, just like we're starting to learn that data is what artificial intelligence is. It's like memory is everything. So if you go to our YouTube channel, it's impressive that we have like what, 40, 50 YouTube videos covering like a huge number of like topics and sectors. We have talks from our own researchers. We have talks from lots of guest researchers. So those of you for whom this is the first introduction to the program, go check out the YouTube channel and like click on a few topics that interest you. It's kind of really amazing just how rich the topic of protocols is. And we, of course, have some nascent distribution. We were like heads down actually doing the research last year, and we started a newsletter that now has about 600 subscribers, but we weren't really focused on that. And that's going to be more of a priority in the coming year. Like maybe we'll be doing more event stuff and distributing more in more sophisticated ways. So our marketing game is a little bit nascent. All right, so that's one set of ingredients. But continuing, we are starting to see the beginnings of what I think of as memetic traction and inception. So here's a couple of ones that stood out. Of course, there have been like lots of tweets that have been there in the background, but these two stood out. This blog post by Dan Finlay. So Dan, by the way, is the guy who leads MetaMask, which is the wallet that most of you probably use to access Web3 and Ethereum stuff. And he wrote an essay that kind of was a response to my summary of Summer Protocols research, as well as Josh Stark's essay on hardness, which I'll mention in a bit. That's going to come out in the next module of published research as well. So he kind of got nerd sniped by what we were doing. And the other one was Emmett Shear, and this was kind of an interesting pathway of influence. So Emmett, some of you might recognize the name. He was the founder of Twitch, and most recently he was the CEO of OpenAI for a couple of days. Yeah, he's been a reader of mine for a while. But apparently a friend asked him if he knew anything about abstraction and protocols. And the friend who asked him that because he had just listened to the podcast Tim and I did on Infinite Loops, Jim O'Shaughnessy's podcast. So it's kind of interesting to see these ideas percolate, right? So Tim and I go on a podcast, talk about it, somebody listens to it, and then asks somebody else about it who happens to be an influencer in the tech world. And that guy does a whole thread about protocol stuff. So if you go look at Emmett's thread, you'll see our own stuff sort of referenced, plus a whole bunch of other things about protocols. So that's happening, beginnings of memetic traction in inception. Podcasts, of course, again, this I would again say very nascent. We haven't sought out or gotten any like PR in the sense of like coverage in the tech press, but we have done some podcasts. So Tim and I have been on a couple of podcasts, and so Infinite Loops is one, Green Pill is another, and several of the individual researchers have also gone on Green Pill talking about their particular projects. So that's, again, I would say at the seed stage, and we need to do better about sort of like growing that in the future. And finally, this is news fresh of last week, which Tim shared with some of you already within the program. But yeah, for those of you outside the program or outside the crypto ecosystem who don't know what this is, the retroactive public goods funding program is a thing run by Optimism, which is L2 technology on top of Ethereum. So L2s are blockchains that run on top of like the Ethereum blockchain. That's the simplest way to explain them. And the Optimism one is a very popular one. And they run these grant programs that are based on this novel idea of like retroactive funding. So if in the ecosystem of like public goods and commons, people are doing interesting work, kind of like just because they're interested and passionate about it, this is a way to incentivize them. So after the fact, not before the fact, after the fact, you can sort of like apply, and based on the work output, you get awards. So the Summer Protocols program, Tim submitted our work, and we did get the grant. So this is 27,300 OP, which is the token of the Optimism network, and that's I think worth about $95,000 right now. And we'll be talking with program participants about like what to do with that shortly. But this is, I think, very good early validation of value. So it's one thing to have tweets and shares and sort of like people being nerd sniped by our memes, but it's kind of nice to see that people see hard value in what we are doing. So this the funding is nice. It's nice to have like all the researchers get a little bit of a bonus, as it were, to continue their work. But even more important is the sort of like signal of value. So those are the ingredients. So effectuation question, what do we do with these ingredients we have? So since I'm using the metaphor of pills, let's think in terms of formulation principles. So I think of pills as a protocolized form of nerd sniping. So if you remember around this time last year, when we put out the pilot study, which was called The Unreasonable Sufficiency of Protocols, several people who read that, this was when March, I think, the reaction to us was, oh, the way you guys have written and talked about this topic, I feel nerd sniped. So this, I think, I don't know who came up with the phrase first, but we kind of immediately took that phrase and ran with it, because that was exactly the impact we wanted to have last year, which is we've got all sorts of like interesting creative people working on the frontiers of interesting technologies, and they tend to be nerds, and nerds tend to get nerd sniped. So by the way, the concept was introduced by an XKCD cartoon, but the idea is you kind of see like the germ of like a really futuristic thing, and you really sort of like get addicted to thinking about it, and you like start to like really go down the bunny trail and get absorbed in these set of ideas. You start seeing the whole world in its terms, and of course, as this joke says, you can get so into it that you get hit by a truck while you're busy thinking about it. So that's nerd sniping, and I think of like billing as kind of like a scaled way of doing that. And of course, I'm sure most of you know that the metaphor of pills comes from the Matrix movies with the red pill and blue pill. And then it kind of like grew into this whole meta meme in online culture. Today, red pill means people who are like sucked into the right-wing ecosystem. And there's other like pill names that like, black pill, purple pill, white pill, clear pill. So if you Google this stuff, there's like even people who make taxonomies of it. The pills are kind of an interesting metaphor for really delivering a set of ideas. And on a personal note, I think the first time I thought or wrote about pilling as a metaphor, I think I wrote a newsletter like 6-7 years ago called "The Internet is a Vast Gray Pill." And at that time, I was using gray pill in my own sense, and I didn't realize that Scott Alexander was also using the term, no, he was using the term gray tribe, I think. But the way I was using the term gray pill is kind of in the opposite sense I'm using it now, which is the internet produces so many diverse perspectives that come at you from all directions and sort of like a confusing mess that you start like disbelieving in any absolute single strong perspective view of the world. So gray pills are in a way the opposite of red pills. It's like skepticism, doubt, triangulation, and so forth. So at the time, I used to kind of like be hostile to the idea of like more how do I put it, charismatic kinds of pilling as opposed to like pills that create doubt as opposed to pills that create certainty. Think of it that way. And since then, as the world has become like full of tribes, sort of like popping different sorts of pills, I've kind of like started thinking more in terms of like, all right, there's all sorts of pills. There's like uncertainty pills versus certainty pills, and both flavors of pills have like good and bad examples. There are pills that, I don't know, turn people into toxic individuals. There are pills that really like uh, unlock creative imagination and like get people really doing interesting things. So pilling is a good and sort of like double-edged metaphor. There are good and bad pills, and various sort of actions. So that's sort of background around pills. So let's think in terms of like, all right, how do we build a protocol pill? And we talk about whether that's a good thing to do in the last section of this talk. All right. All right. So I want to like put down a few themes that kind of popped for me as these are like lighthouse concepts that we should be thinking about and building our sort of future thinking around. So one that was kind of like already on our radar this time last year was Josh's essay on hardness. So he wrote an essay called Atoms, Institutions, and Blockchains, trying to get at the fundamentals of what is actually the fundamental sort of like conceptual advance represented by things like blockchains. And he identified the property of hardness, which is kind of analogous to information and information theory. So I'll read that definition in case that slide is not super clear, but this is, I don't know where I stole the slide from, somewhere on Twitter, but human civilization depends in part on our ability to make the future more certain in specific ways, fixed hard points across time that let us make the world more predictable. This is what hardness is. This is what blockchains in particular and protocols in general, I think, deliver. And I think this is a topic that we're, it's just the beginning. Like Josh has posed a very interesting set of questions, and I think it's like very rich if you start unpacking it. So Josh and I have been talking in the background, and we had this exchange on Warpcast that I thought was funny. So I've been nerd sniped by the hardness concept. Let me put it that way. For this year, last year I was nerd sniped by just basic idea of protocols. This year, hardness in particular has nerd sniped me. So this was one of my musings, which is hardness selects between futures, uncertainty selects within futures, and Josh responded with. He's one of the few people I'll admit has like probably a better talent for a turn of phrase than me. But hardness cuts, uncertainty glues is like a lovely phrase that I'd like to see repeated more often. So I'm not going to explain the phrase if it sort of like tracks for you. That's great, but we can talk about it later. But the point is, hardness is a very interesting property of like both technical and social systems that allows us to I don't know, think about the world in a different way. And this year, like, I'd like to do that with protocols in a more systematic way, like almost double click the top level concepts and look at like second order concepts that really start to unpack what it is here that we're doing. So hardness is one thing I want to talk about. Where were we? Oh, I kind of skipped right past this one. I like whenever I'm sort of like in the early stages of thinking about like a long period of activity. So we are thinking a year out now. I like to think in terms of models. So last year, I think almost by accident, we put this quote in our pilot study. Civilization advances by extending the number of operations we can perform without thinking about them. So this is an A.N. Whitehead quote, famous philosopher, and it was like it was almost casually included in the introduction of the pilot study, but very soon it became clear that it was a very important orientation thought. And I would say half the research projects over the summer kind of like in some way orbited this thought of like, what does this mean? How do we unpack it? What does it mean to like extend the number of operations? What does it mean to not think about it? Are we talking about behaviors becoming unconscious? So this was a very fertile motto, I would say. And for 2024, I'm kind of making up one that's a snow clone of this Jim Barksdale quote, which is famous in Silicon Valley, which is there's only two ways to make money in business. One is to bundle, the other is to unbundle. And my port is there are only two ways to advance civilization. The first is to protocolize, the second is to deprotocolize. Now, I like this thought because it gets at two things. One is, I think one of the big things we discovered last year, and Nadia's project was especially focused on this, is that protocols are double-edged technologies. We don't want to be like naively optimistic, Pollyannish thinkers who are like just going hustling and I don't know, cheerleading technology just because it's technology. As Nadia's research showed, we do want to like be mindful of the double-edged nature of any technology, including protocols, and like ask, all right, how does it work for good? How does it work for bad? How do you like use and govern and regulate technology so that it does more good and bad? So that's one reason I want to like talk about deprotocolizing as well, because there are such things as bad protocols. Like last year, one of our big insights was it's very useful to think in terms of Kafka protocols. Like, what is the absolute worst protocol you can think of? Like, is it the TSA pre-check or TSA security lines at the airport? What is it? And if you see a really bad protocol, dismantling it, taking it apart is almost as important an intellectual and technological undertaking as thinking of and building good protocols. So it's, I think, a very, very much more sophisticated and how to put it, less messy way of thinking of creative destruction. Like, so long as you can think in terms of protocolizing and deprotocolizing, hopefully you can avoid more sort of like ugly ways of sort of doing creative destruction, like, war or breakdown or chaos, right? So I like to think of like war and conflict maybe as protocolization and deprotocolization by other means. Just like, war is politics by other means, it's also protocolization and deprotocolization by other means. And conflict, by the way, in one way or the other, is one of the themes that's popped as top of mind for 2024 research. And Tim especially has been sort of like noodling on that aspect. Okay, so nerd sniping versus pilling, motto, hardness as one of the interesting Lighthouse concepts to steer around. Going a little bit meta, how do you think systematically about what pills do, and in particular, what a protocol pill could do? And a good framework for thinking about this that some of you may be familiar with is this idea of like developmental levels by the developmental psychologist Robert Kegan. I think that's how you say his name. But he was popularized in recent years by some of the work of David Chapman. I'm linking there one particular blog post that I think is a particularly good introduction that I stole that picture from. The picture itself is from Kegan's own work, but his development model is basically 5 stages. And think of like stage 1 as like basically a baby that really hasn't like developed levels of cognition, and stage 5 as like some sort of enlightened sage, and it's like a development trajectory through that. And one of the ways of like thinking about how this development trajectory works is a shift from I am statements to I have statements. So for example, if you say, I am such and such race or religion or identity, that's an I am statement. If you say I have, you're at a distance from it, where your identity isn't anchored to like, a particular attribute of yourself. You're like arm's length from that. So shifting from I am statements to I have statements is kind of the mechanism by which you sort of climb this Kegan ladder. And I found this like a useful way to frame what we want protocol pilling to do and how to think about like the effects of protocol pilling. And this is partly synthesis of a lot of the research, my gloss on like, all right, what is actually being communicated by what the researchers are like figuring out through their work. So we want to shift from I am my protocols, so you're like, like fish in water, you can't see the protocols all around you, to I have protocols, like you're able to adopt something of like a metacognitive stance towards the systems you're embedded in, and therefore you have agency over not just your actions within the protocols, but your actions on the protocol. So you can protocolize and deprotocolize. If you're stuck in a TSA security line, you aren't just trapped and frustrated and yelling and screaming. You can step out a little bit and ask, all right, what's going on here? How do I read my situation? What's good and bad about it? How can it be retuned? What agency do I have to like affect my particular circumstances immediately, right? So that's what this going from I am to I have does. And I think being nerd sniped by protocols or being protocol build allows you to acquire that sort of like cognitive ability. And if you're being like, I don't know, conceited about this, you can say maybe this is like, level 4 to level 5 kind of shift in perspective. Maybe it's like, you're getting to the enlightened level, at least on some dimensions. So I made this 2-column sort of breakdown of many of the themes we talked about last year within this framework of I am to I have. By the way, I think Angela, I don't know if Angela is here, her project, she's still writing up her essay, is particularly sort of like on the nose about this thing, about like, being in protocols versus like, outside them and having them and being able to like, be metacognitive about this. But okay, so I'll just call out a few of the items here. So feeling trapped and frustrated by the system versus being able to see the system. Being trapped in a Kafka protocol and going postal, whether you, I don't know, become like a mass shooting person or you like take a meat cleaver and like attack all the bureaucrats in the DMV or whatever it is, that's like going postal within the system because you can't really see the system. And then, having the protocol literacy to actively dismantle the bad protocols. I really liked Jeff Manner's guest talk at the beginning of last year's guest talk sessions on the burglar's guide to the city. And I've increasingly started thinking of like, the burglar's guide to being inside the API, as opposed to this sort of like helpless framing of you're either above the API or below the API. Either the Uber API is telling you what to do as a driver or as a business manager or like, shareholder of Uber, you're above the protocol and kind of helplessly watching the system evolve. And I've come to the view that both being above and being below the API is in a way being trapped by it, because there's this layer of like impenetrable technology that's completely shaping the behavior of the system that you feel a little bit helpless in controlling. Everything is like, it happens to you rather than you doing things. So burglar's guide to being inside the API, that's another I am to I have shift. We already talked about like, David Foster Wallace's famous essay of like, this is water. Like, how do you get fish to see water? You can go through this list on your own later, or we can discuss it. We can post a screenshot maybe. But one of the things I personally find most interesting is number 13, which is the exit versus voice view of systems has been really popular in the last few years, especially in the crypto ecosystem, which has this sort of like helpless framing of like systems are what they are. You either like voice your sort of like criticisms of them from within, which kind of makes you like, a whiny customer service sort of like complainer, or you get pissed off and you exit altogether. And it's like there are no other ways to like relate to a system. And I think once you get protocol literate, once you level up, you start seeing yourself in much more complex ways. And I think of this as like you have your OODA loop in relation to the system, and you can access its behaviors and ways of like shaping what it does in like way more ways. Like everybody else is limited to the tip of the iceberg of like interaction with the system, and you get to like access the whole iceberg of what the system can do and how you can like hack it. So all these things I think are part of like being protocol built, which is why I think it's like hugely useful to make this transition personally or technically. Of course, the pill metaphor also highlights the idea that there are side effects. There is no such thing as a pill without side effects, right? And we talked about a lot of them last year in various ways. For example, for most people, if you just use the word protocol in a human sense, you think of like mindless bureaucrats who are like completely unresponsive, and you're trapped and frustrated by their like indifference and apathy. And if you're talking technological systems, it's the same thing, right? It's in some ways even worse. Like if something, Google is actually a good example. Like if you have a website and something happens where your website gets marked as spam or something, and you get I don't know, marked as bad in the Google search engine, it's really impossible to fix. Like you can hire people, there's no way to penetrate the bureaucracy of Google to tell them that, hey, this is an accident, you shouldn't do this to me. So, that's one side effect of like a protocolized world. And this, I think, is a big reason why so many people have a knee-jerk aversion to protocolized systems. They're like, this is by definition going to be oppressive. And this is why, like, I think the current political winds are all driven not so much by deprotocolization or dismantlement in a systematic sense, but more like, tear it all down, burn it all down politics, right? So the entire Republican candidate slate this year, including Trump's second round, plus similar things around the world, it's mostly about this doesn't work. Let's take a sledgehammer or like, burn it all down. And then, I don't know, they have like a belief in markets or personal networks. I don't know what they think comes in its place, but I think it's a reaction to bureaucratic proceduralism gone wrong, right? There's also a form of a content cognitive biases. We've run into this in some of our internal discussions. We've talked about like, how do we take some of these research and maybe turn into consulting fodder for helping organizations run better? We've been having some discussions. Timber Schroff has been leading some of those discussions. But one of the first things we ran into is, should we make up much more, middle management, boilerplate, block diagram, process crap? And that's like a form of our content cognitive bias. And protocolism kind of like promotes that, right? So you have to be mindful of that and deal with it. It tends to have like, just like there's a seeing like a state effect. So that's James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State. If you have an authoritarian person in a large centralized system, that person sees in a very homogenizing way. Everybody looks like the same kind of like gray pawn on a chessboard, right? And we like to think that protocols and decentralized systems don't have that pathology, but in fact they do. Like if you are like a decentralized P2P network builder or a protocol designer, it's very easy to slip into a mindset where all protocol actors look like the same faceless creatures milling around your technological system. So you have to counter that. And of course, anytime you build protocol-like things or work within them, you can get distracted from what you're trying to do with like secondary sort of like, I think of as like derailments of motivation, which is, hey, you want to maybe work on a problem like solving climate change, then you get sucked into this world of like climate change protocols and your motivation shifts and your goal is now to capture the protocol and be the dominant voting player on it or whatever, right? So these are all things that can happen, and we explored a lot of this last year as well. So this is kind of my backgrounder on like what we have to think about when formulating the protocol pill. Oops. Okay, yeah. So I don't have a pill. I don't know how to pill people yet. We have the starting point of like a bunch of ingredients. But we can start to think about how do we actually formulate this pill? What are the different dose sizes? Like if you're chatting with somebody on, Twitter or Forecaster or Blue Sky or whatever, and they ask, what's this protocol thing you're writing or talking about? What's the one-liner reply? That I think of as a microdosing. Like, can you like protocol pill somebody with one line? I think it's hard. It's more of like a deep domain thing, all the way to like what we are trying to do in the program, which is like, send people a 500-page kit. So that's a different kind of form factor of the pill. So what are the different dose sizes? We've talked a lot about like the social side of protocols, and we did a little bit on technology last year. I think this year we might shift the emphasis more towards the technology side. But what role does technology play? Like how is protocol technology different from like just, products or machines or devices? And David Lang's research last year on standards and being a standards on protocols entrepreneur, I think shed some early light on that. We're beginning to wrap our minds around how should you think about technology from a protocol build perspective, and how must the pill be modified for different audiences? And again, the pill metaphor is useful. Like if you look at the early history of pharmacology, there's a great book by, it's kind of a little dated. It's by Paul D. Kroof called Microbe Hunters. It's 1960s. But yeah, the earliest way people came up with medicines and pills was basically looking for magic bullets through massive trial and error. Like just try a million compounds and see if one of them like cures a disease. And I think some sort of arsenic formulation or sulfur drugs, these were like early pills for like syphilis or something. So it was a magic pill approach. And at some point, systematic theories of pharmacological action came about, and you could like formulate pills in more systematic ways. AI is going to change that a lot, by the way. So question for all of you, both in relation, so for the researchers, in relation to your own individual research, how do you turn that into a billing mechanism, right? And for all of us, how do we do that at a program level? And for all of you with stakes in like the world of protocols, whether in crypto or beyond, or an outside interest in it, like maybe you want to like take this and make this a basis of like new ways of running organizations or countries. How do you like formulate bills at that level? So think about this at whatever level and scope your thinking is at. Okay. Switching from the how to the what, I think we've been saying all along in the last year that our goal is to create like a culture of protocol literacy and create what I think of as a protocol scene. Similar to like, how the maker scene didn't exist 20 years ago, then like, O'Reilly publishing, people working on like Arduinos and 3D printers, all those people came together somehow. And now suddenly we have a thriving maker scene and industry. And there's like this whole literate population that knows how to hack with like advanced but cheap tools and like, build all sorts of things with Arduinos and things. So that's kind of the trajectory we've been inspired by. We've also been inspired by things like, the Whole Earth catalog that Stuart Brand published in the 60s. So there's lots of precedents. So how do you go from pills to kits to scenes? So first, a quick sort of relationship conceptual framework I'm building here. I think of a kit as a pill delivery protocol in the sense that, a pill is more than just like a powder. You kind of have to decide what kind of like shape of container to put it in. How do you like put it in bottles? What's the dosing regimen? 10 milligrams twice a day, or 20 milligrams once a day, or 70 milligrams once a week, or like how do you want to think about it, right? Who controls it? Is it going to be prescription only or not? So all those are part of the delivery protocol of pill, right? So the kit is our first attempt at coming up with a delivery protocol. But this is now underway, I kind of took a step back and asked, what exactly is a kit and how does it affect this kind of like billing adventure? And I was inspired here by an article David Lang pointed us to, which is, I think, called Kits and Revolutions, which I think we've all read, about how if you look into the heart of any major revolution, you find kit-like things in them. So here's kind of my map of like any kit that achieves a pilling. So of course, there's a pill itself. So in our case, we're trying to create a protocol pill that, has some sort of perspective shift. Maybe it's Keegan level 4 to 5, whatever it is. We have a perspective pill, but that's not enough. You have a whole bunch of other things that are needed to make a complete package that creates a scene. I'll just go through these very quickly. I think every scene has what you might call an attitude elixir, right? So optimism versus pessimism is one. So if you look at Silicon Valley lately, they've been like really trying to push the optimism elixir. There's modes of agency. Again, Silicon Valley is a good precedent. Like it was at some point, you needed $2 million to run a website startup in 2000. But at some point, it was like there are cloud technologies, there's like GitHub, there's like very cheap tools, and instead of $2 million with just like completely free stack of tools and maybe a credit card for like a $5 a month subscription, you can now start a website. And that was the start of the Web 2.0 revolution. And that was a set of tools, modes of agency. So that's another part of a kit. There's an aesthetic sensibility. Is this like smarmy and like childishly optimistic? Is this like dystopian and sort of like dark and gothic? Or what is the aesthetic sensibility around a kit? I think that's a very important piece because it determines who self-selects in or gets the hell out. Again, thanks to Kia and others who worked on memory-related projects last year, I've started thinking strongly in terms of really how you remember history. Your collective memory orientation is a very important part of a kit. Like once you have like a build person who looks at the world a certain way, they look at the history of where we are in a different way as well, right? So if you think about like an ideal protocol build person and ask them, give me the 5-minute version of the history of civilization, they might give you a history in terms of like more and more sophisticated protocols layering themselves, creating the civilization we know today. So it's a way of like organizing your memory, right? So collective memory orientation. I also think anytime you have a kit-like structure, people also seek comfort in different ways. And by this, I mean things like, escapist fiction. Like, for example, if you're religion pilled, if you're a devout Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, it comes prepackaged with a set of mythologies and legends and like ways of making sense of the world that are like not strictly literal minded, right? So there's a whole escapist comfort around it. Silicon Valley has its own culture of like science fiction and stuff, and we have our I think the beginnings of protocol fiction. We've talked about it a little bit. So that's another one. And finally, local conditions. I think all scenes and kits and things begin in particular places. They don't come out of nowhere. So the maker movement was in fact a product of like, particular scenes in the Bay Area, plus like a couple of scenes around the world where 3D printing was being pushed. So it had like a path dependence and initial conditions effect, right? So this is, I think, what a kit is. And if we map our own protocol kit to it, I think our attitude elixir is we're going beyond optimism and pessimism. So Ritika has written a series of like fictions that kind of, I think, thread this needle well. Nadia's essay is another one that I think strikes a balance between optimism and pessimism, right? Modes of agency. Drew's essay is accompanied by a set of like patterns for people who want to like think about protocols in urban environments. Perspective pill, we've already talked about it. The Whitehead quote, all the memes we were like talking about in 2023, they gives a particular perspective. Aesthetic sensibility, I think where we were last year was like it kind of orbited the idea of protocol humor. At the retreat, a lot of us were trying to make jokes with protocol themes, and most of them fell completely flat, and that itself was funny. But humor was like a aesthetic sensibility core for us. It was a bit dark or dank and focused on themes like structure versus fluidity, but that's our aesthetics. And you guys can feel free to like chime in and talk about this, especially on the forum. I'd like to discuss this. But yeah, I think that's something to pay attention to. Collective memory orientation, well, the history of the world as a history of protocols and standards. So look at Timber's essay, safety in coal mining. Look at David's essay. Look at Kia's meta framing. Escapist comfort, protocol fiction, I think, is a thing. Like I wasn't sure of this time last year, but now that I've seen several examples both out there and within the program, I do think protocol fiction is a thing. And of course, local conditions. Last year, we were a little, I don't know, wary of the fact that so many of our applications and so many of our selected researchers were coming from very particular pockets in the world that were already thinking about some of these things. So I was making fun of it, calling it the Berlin-Brooklyn mafia. I think that's about half the researchers in the program. But the positive side of that is the unfair advantage, unique, special initial conditions where you have people who already have an advantage in thinking about certain things. They should take a lead in like, getting the world rolling on certain topics, right? And of course, Ethereum is another of the local ecosystems from which this kind of thinking can emerge. So that's our analyzing our kit. And again, within the sort of like I am to I have framework, why is this important? So like once you have a build, person, a kit, a scene, the important thing is the effectuation that we were talking about, it applies at a much larger scale. So whereas typically you talk to people at a party or wherever, and everybody's moaning and whining about like all the big impossible problems in the world, and usually they have like this impossible, wicked problem framing of it. Like I think AI alignment as safety is kind of a bullshit framing that is basically impossible, and it just allows you to moan and whine. But if you switch over to like, all right, I have this hammer which we call protocols, and is this a nail? And one way you might think of it is, can zero knowledge proofs and cryptography be used in interesting ways to make AI safer, right? Again, climate is another big problem everybody is sort of like feeling helpless about. And you have like these frames that are not really frames for action. They're frames for like, I don't know, religious whining almost. Like degrowth and climate denial are both equally bad. Can we think in terms of protocolizing and deprotocolizing various behaviors for climate? Like last year, we had two guest talks on climate. So Dara and Corey both did interesting talks, one general climate protocols and one crypto in particular. And that was kind of like refreshing. It's like, this is the right way to think about climate, not sitting around moaning about like how the system is broken, right? So that's the importance of like pills, kits, scenes. it gets you to what I think of as oblique attacks on like big issues, problems, and teams, right? Where everybody else is feeling stuck and helpless. That's why when you discover a powerful new way of looking at the world, it's kind of like something you should grab onto and do things with. Okay, wanted to give you a quick example of a transformation in my own thinking. Many of you know I like to make maps of things I'm thinking about, and if you've seen past maps I've produced in the last decade, they've mostly been like, large-scale natural environments with like topographies of like, mountains, rivers, and stuff. This time, due to the influence of like the thinking in this program, and in particular the folks working on like urbanism protocols, so Drew, Chanot, and others, I really started thinking about how cities are, in fact, a really rich metaphor for mapping out a concept space. And I came on this one in particular because I like Simon Wardley's view of technological evolution as you go in any emerging technology from a pioneer phase to a settler phase to a town planning phase. And I think AI as a sector is now in its town planning phase. So a city is a really good metaphor for what is happening in AI right now. So I made this map, which I posted in my newsletter last week. And next week, I'll be doing like a corporate speaking gig. And this map is now my primary frame for thinking about it. So this is what I mean by what being built is. What does it mean to be protocol built? You make such like conscious high level decision shifts of like how to even think about a topic, right? So it's a very powerful thing. So this is my example. I'm sure all of you have your own examples of how being immersed in thinking about protocols has like subtly or radically shifted your perspectives and frames around other things. So you could make a similar map of like climate. You could make a similar map of robotics. Like a protocol built person simply makes different maps of the world they see around them. Many of you have seen this slide before. I keep repeating it like a broken record. We've taken a lot of inspiration from like historic scenes that have had big impacts on the world. And in the context of this talk, I wanted to throw up the slide of the examples we've been thinking about. All these groups, if you think about their work and history and impact, not one of them started out with the question of, hey, we have this very difficult, real problem in the world right now. How do we solve it? And then you come up with an impossible frame and like moan about it, right? All of them started with, hey, we have this interesting idea, tool, technology, approach, perspective, something that's a starting point rather than an ending point, and then asking, what can we do with it? What's interesting about what we have and where can we go with it? So, Vienna Circle, positivism, Bloomsbury set the whole sort of like literary tradition of modernism that emerged from it. Bach group, complexity theory, the mother of all demos from Engelbart, the beginning of personal computing. Park, what can you do now that transistors are super cheap and you can waste them? The International Geophysical Year, what can we do now that we have reliable ships and research instrumentation and we don't have to be brave Arctic explorers? We can actually just send normal scientists out to explore the world. Well, you can actually build a model of the entire planet. Dartmouth Workshop, computers are powerful. Can we build artificial intelligence? Macy Conference, we have all these conceptual tools around, systems and computing and things like that. Can we do this thing called cybernetics? They're all effectual, not teleological. They don't start with goals or problems or end states. They start with what they have and ask where can they go with it. I've shown this slide before many times as well, but the new bullet point I added to it is effectual or teleological thinking. But yeah, all the rest still stays the same. So the question I've been asking myself, of course, throughout this last few months is, what's the protocol for having a bigger impact? So sorry if that's kind of like a more management question than like a core research question. But finally, let's see how am I doing on time. 5 minutes. Sorry, I'm going a little long. If you guys can stay like 10 minutes later, we can discuss some Q&A with those of you who can stay on. But quick thought on why. Vitalik wrote this essay recently that I think is really important for everybody to read, not just for the specific narrow future of Ethereum that he's talking about, but I think everything in the world. So not make Ethereum cypherpunk again, but make everything protocol punk again. Like, 1940s, 50s, all the smartest people and most interesting and creative people in the world were thinking in terms of like, how do we get away from like Wild West chaos and build interesting systems and protocols to actually create a world around ourselves? And it was a very interesting era that created the world that we live in today. And I think we need another phase of that kind of thinking, like make everything protocol punk again. So that's the phrase I want to think of. So there's the last slide, I think. No, one more. So the preview of summer 2024 won't get into too many details, but top level idea for us is last year was doing a lot of writing and exploring ideas. This year we want to move downstream a little bit to applications, experiments, and realizations. We do want to like do this thing of like, can we get to oblique attacks on contemporary concerns? Like, don't go straight at AI safety, come at it from an angle. Like, what is an important protocol question that somehow as a side effect solves AI safety, for example? And at a more practical level, we're exploring a lot of partnerships. You'll hear more about that in the future. And if you are part of an institution or organization that might want to partner with us for Summer Protocols 2024, reach out to Tim or me. So that's a quick preview. And the discussion question I want to leave you with is, when is this kind of like universal attempt to like get everybody on the planet protocol build is what we are effectively trying to do? When is that actually a good idea? And there are cases when we historically have concluded that it's overall a good thing. Like, everybody can read and write. I think on balance, everybody agrees that it's a good thing. Everybody has money literacy. You know how to like earn money and then use the money to buy things you want that you can't make yourself. That's like literacy that's universal that we think is good, right? Markets, I think it's good. There's more contention there. Programming is an example of like, I think a failed one. Like, over the last decade, everybody was saying everybody should learn to code. I now think I don't believe that, but maybe still true. But same question with protocol literacy. But I'll stop with that. And I think I have 3 minutes left for question, but I can stay for like as long as people want to chat. So I'll stop here and stop the share and open it up. Comments, questions? Look at the chat. Forum link. No. Kevin made that hardest thing. All right, I guess that was a big info dump. Nobody has any questions. But yeah, the forum thread, I hope once you have had a chance to chew on this, please do post your thoughts and reactions. Now, this is the right time to influence our thinking as we try to like come up with the shape for Summer Protocols 2024. Shino, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, so one thing I'm thinking about with the use of the pill metaphor is that at least, well, in the original Matrix movie and sort of the cultural reception of the pill, it implies a radical rupture or sort of revolutionary change in how you see the world. And that's clearly, I think, one of the goals of introducing protocolized thinking, but I'd be curious about your more specific thoughts on the implied sort of revolutionary aspects of pills.
I think so there's revolutionary and there's discontinuous, right? So there's like quantum jumps, like there is like a clear before and after for a shift versus that shift itself being violent, chaotic, or involving lots of breakdowns and stuff. So I think people often conflate those two. That's why I was like trying to distinguish between the protocolizing and deprotocolizing versus like, creative destruction in the Schumpeter sense. I think it is important to like entertain possibilities for discontinuous jumps and change. Like sometimes evolutionary incremental changes just doesn't do the trick. You do have to like radically change your perspective and do something, but it doesn't necessarily lock you or commit you to like violent or revolutionary in the sense of like chaotic violence and conflict approaches. There are ways to be like revolutionary without triggering massive conflict. Like, the iPhone moment is one. Like Steve Jobs stood up on stage, like presented this new device, and suddenly the world had changed in a very discontinuous sense. And all of us like completely wrapped our mind around reality in a very different way. So yeah, I have to say I was skeptical of like the revolutionary aspects of pills when I first started playing with the metaphor 20 years ago, same as everybody else, especially when it was weird. Like in the movie itself, now that we read the movie, the red pill was clearly kind of like a gender dysphoria metaphor for the Wachowskis. And it's really ironic that it got recoded, transcoded into red pill meaning, right-wing politics. But that tells you that, yeah, it's kind of a powerful metaphor if it can like travel from one end of the political spectrum to the other. But I think I've made my peace with the fact that there is discontinuous revolutionary elements to such thinking. But yeah, Scott, Gordon, yeah.
Yeah, I just sort of jotted down some thoughts in the chat, but as you were talking about pills, I was thinking about the differences in epistemologies between oral cultures and literary cultures, as like McLuhan and Ong wrote about. You know, you have kind of one set of functioning beliefs or ways of transferring knowledge in oral culture, and then you get to literary culture, you get, you know, the invention of facts, the scientific method, these kinds of things. You know, the idea of a fact checker kind of making sense in a literary culture. And I've been reflecting on the breakdown of that model and the sort of prison yard model that seems to be emerging, where you choose your tribe. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on pilling. I was kind of wondering, you know, is this sort of the functional epistemology of network culture, sort of religious conversion to various tribes?
Yeah, I think it's actually more powerful than that, because when you use pilling in the context of like moving your epistemology from whatever you have to that of a particular tribe, you're still talking a subset of the world, right? Like it's like, all right, you get red pill, you start listening to a particular podcast host and you start thinking in certain ways, but you're still like, whatever, 30% of the population. Whereas something like universal literacy, it's potentially something that can become completely universal. Like there are large parts of the world where 90+% of the world is literate. There are parts which still have like, less than 30-40% literacy. So we still have those examples available to compare like literate versus non-literate cultures. But it's interesting that there are certain pills that can in fact go universal, and all meaningful dissent kind of basically goes extinct, at least for a while. So take, textual culture. Since the invention of the Gutenberg press and its slow percolation, we're now at a stage where in many parts of the world, textual culture is the only culture and there is no meaningful dissent. Dissent takes the form of within textual culture, right? And of course, that means that any fatal flaws in the epistemology kind of like get buried in it, and it takes centuries for them to start showing up as cracks in the system. And we are seeing that, I think, with textual culture now. Like, it's breaking down. There's a return to oral culture. I think of the internet as partly an oral culture, even though it's textual. Like we use messaging and Twitter and stuff in a more oral modality, but that's okay. Like some pills are not powerful enough to be universal, and therefore they become like active dialectics of like for and against. Some pills are so powerful, an entire generation or two completely takes the pill, and then you have to like work for the logic of history to work itself out, and it fails, and then you replace it with something better. So that's kind of my general approach to that. Pilling may install universal software, exactly. Yeah, Dorian? I think you might be muted or something.
Yeah, I'm on route here. I'm curious. I missed the first half of didn't show up in my calendar, but I'm curious to the extent that the stuff, the map, etc. Like, have you gone in front of a room full of business leaders yet and protocol filled them, or is that still pending?
Things like the maps to protocol pill business leaders, that's you're kind of like blurring out there, but that was the gist of the question.
Yeah, I'm curious, have you protocol pilled a room full of business leaders yet, or is that still pending?
Have I personally done that? No, actually next week will be my first opportunity. There'll be a fireside chat with a group of 75 people. The talk is about AI, but I'm going to try and incept protocol thinking via that map and sort of like bring in protocol threads in what I say. So it'll be my first experiment in doing that. But I have had, I think, individual experiences of protocol pilling people from completely outside this ecosystem. And I think the original pilot study we wrote has been super effective in that. Like some people read that and say, this is the right way to think about business. This is the right way to think about organizations. And this should be a whole way of thinking about MBAs. So I've had that with like individuals, I would say, experienced managerial people in the business world. But yeah, I think one of the interesting challenges for next year, which some of you are thinking about together, is can you make this systematic? Can you like I don't know, do business consulting around protocol-based thinking, for example.
Yeah, and it would also be interesting to try to like knit together like Ackoff, Deming, Brucker, et cetera, like all the kind of like paleo management consultant stuff into the protocol modality.
Yeah, I think there's like almost an embarrassment of riches here, or what the military likes to call a target-rich environment. If you start with the idea that, all right, I'm personally nerd sniped and I'm going to formulate my own attitude into a pill and peddle it to other people, it's like there's a million directions you could go with it. And I think one of the interesting things we could try next year is run the experiments. Like, what's the right way to deliver this thinking? Try 6 ways, maybe only 2 of them kind of work, 1 of them works well, 4 of them fail utterly. So I think we have to be really in a trial and error mode to some extent. But in another way, we don't have to be completely magic bullet trial and erroring this. There is a lot of like existing knowledge and wisdom out there in the world we could leverage, right? You could go talk to say a single protocol build person in an industry who knows that industry deeply and listen to what they have to say about, all right, how do you actually translate this thinking into terms that this particular industry can understand, or this particular policy environment can understand, or this national governance body can understand. So there's a mix of like random trial and error here, which includes like drawing in source material both from what we've done and like casting a wide net beyond. Like I really dislike not invented here syndrome. So we have our research, we have like research that is resonates with it, and then like a much wider net each from like your individual disciplines that you can pull in. Like Shino, a lot about architecture. Presumably there's like 10 interesting references you would pull in on protocol billing architecture people in addition to what we've produced in the program, right? So we have to think in that kind of like targeted specific trial and error mode, I think. Yeah, see a comment from Timber. Yeah, the idea of securing hardness and becoming a self-transforming mind seems kind of at odds with each other. How does a protocol will accomplish both? This is an actually very subtle question, and I think for a long time I was trapped in this dichotomy too. And I think my response to that is you can have a fluid perspective, but still have hardness in how you act and behave in the world. A really good example of this that I think I wrote about in a post about 10 years ago. It was like how to think like Hercule Poirot. So I just rewatched the entire Hercule Poirot detective mysteries on BritBox over the winter. And an interesting thing about Hercule Poirot is he's like a psychology-based detective. His psychology is very subtle. He can see lots of different perspectives, see all sorts of like gray areas, ambiguities, and so forth. But when it comes down to like solving the murder and like forming a moral judgment of the murder, he has a very hard line he draws in the sand. And often in many novels, he'll say something like, I do not approve of murder. That's his line in the sand. It's like, I may understand your motives. I may understand the specific circumstances that made you do what you did. Maybe the person who got murdered really deserved it. Like, all the fluid gray area thinking that goes into solving a murder from a psychological point of view. But when it comes down to like the protocol of action, it would be like, I don't approve of murder. You're getting arrested, tried, prosecuted, and sentenced to whatever the criminal code in your country does. So I think that's how you thread that needle. So I don't know if that's quite the answer, but yeah, I see thumbs up from Timber. So hopefully that was satisfactory. Right.
Where did the hardness concept come from?
Josh was on the call, but he dropped off, I guess. But I think hardness came, if you read the original Atoms, Institutions, Blockchains essay by Josh, it kind of gets at most of it. But I would say basically the idea is if you want certainty in the future, certainty in time and action and behavior space maps to hardness in some sort of like material or infrastructure space, right? So diamonds are a hard thing, and therefore economic sort of transactional environments built around trading diamonds, they acquire a certain hardness. It's like, you do this thing for me and I'll give you a little pouch of diamonds, right? That's kind of a very hard thing. So that's the thinking he tried to generalize in that essay. I'm kind of doing a bad job of summarizing this, but I think that's roughly it. Like same thing with like, why does crypto work? Because like, public key cryptography and one-way encryption are like a hard physics level hardness thing that technology can enable, which means if you make a commit, like a good example is like, I make a prediction about the future and I encrypt it with SHA-256 and post it on Twitter. And when the outcome is actually clear, I reveal what I said. Now that's like a hard coordination type thing I've done. Like I can't lie about what I thought. I can't like fake the prediction. So that's an example of like using hardness and like material or like information technologies to create hardness in commitment structures and behaviors in time and behavior. So yeah, I think that's a very important concept to build around in 2024, at least for me personally. Maybe not everybody will resonate with that Lighthouse concept. Yeah, protocol as minimum viable hardness is a good way of thinking of it, Gordon. All right, so we're 10 over. Thanks everybody. And again, a reminder, please do join the forum thread, and like after you've chewed and reflected on this for a while, post your thoughts. Also, we are trying to do a reading of the week. We're experimenting with that. So Toby just posted an essay from the Other Internet group on crypto's three-body problem. So take a look and weigh in on that. So let's, I don't know, exercise our muscles on how to do good forum discussions here. All right. Thank you.
Awesome.
Everybody.
Thank you so much, Venkat, for your talk. And yeah, join the forum. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks for Chanel's researcher salon on her summer protocols project.